civil rights era was a time of immense change. In addition to the rights obtained by African Americans, a revolution in public education also occurred: Boston busing. Boston busing was one of the most dramatic times in American history. Boston, under court authority, had to desegregate their public schools. To do this, they bused minority students to schools that provided a better education and had more opportunities. At the time, people were still adjusting to the societal change, and the legislation passed to enforce racial equality. And there were many who outright opposed the transportation of minority students.
To our neighborhoods where our kids are safe. We want our kids safe. We want our children safe. And we never want them safe. If I told you to eat shit, you wouldn't know.
The monumental achievement of desegregating Boston public schools didn't come easily, and the struggle for diverse schools started all the way in 1896.
Plessy v. Ferguson was the court case that declared blacks and whites separate but equal. This case was used as a precedent to justify racial segregation all across the United States. As a result, whites and blacks were forced into different restaurants, different parks, different places in public transportation, and even something as small as having to drink from different water fountains. Segregation was considered the standard until the case of Brown v. Board of Education was brought to the Supreme Court. The case specifically dealt with Linda Brown, a young African-American girl who had been denied admission to her local elementary school in Topeka, Kansas because of the color of her skin. As exemplified by the majority opinion written by Chief Justice Earl Warren, the nation's highest court ruled that not only was the separate but equal doctrine unconstitutional in Linda's case, it was unconstitutional in all cases because educational segregation stamped an inherent badge of inferiority on African American students. Unfortunately, the Brown v. Board of Education ruling did little to actually achieve the goal of desegregation. Black students still attended schools with substandard facilities, out-of-date textbooks, and almost no basic school supplies.
Segregation was still prominent in the South after Brown versus the Board of Education. In Little Rock, Arkansas, for example, 9 students who enrolled in all-white central high schools faced angry mobs and threats from the governor, eventually leading to President Eisenhower's call for military action to protect the students.
Boston schools also grew more segregated in the decades after Brown, as the district bused white children to white neighborhood schools that had more resources and better teachers. This was known as the White Flight. Across Boston's public schools in the 1950s, per-pupil spending averaged $340 for white students compared to $240 for black students, highlighting the disparity among the two races. A follow-up to Brown v. Board of Education was the Racial Imbalance Act of 1965, which made the segregation of public schools illegal in Massachusetts. Similarly to the passage of Brown v. Board of Education, the Racial Imbalance Act did little to initially desegregate public schools. To hasten the process of diversifying schools, the Boston School Committee was told that the complete integration of Boston public schools needed to occur before September 1966, or else they would lose funding. In response, Boston Public Schools incorporated busing transportation of students to desegregate the schools. This caused major public uproar and led to a series of racial protests in Boston and riots that garnered national attention.
We don't teach our kids to hate anybody. All we want for our kids is to love and to get a decent education and to live decently as human beings. But we're not even distinguished as human beings as far as East Boston goes or South Boston. We're niggers. And I would be damned if I had any child of mine exposed to anything like that. I wouldn't want my child to sit beside it because, see, I'm not going to teach it to hate. And that's what's happening. That's the lesson that those kids have been getting out there in South Boston. Stand beside Mommy, sweetie, and throw a rock at the nigger.
During one of the riots, a prominent black attorney named Ted Landsmark was severely beaten by some young white men who were protesting the busing. The picture of this occurrence blew up in the news because it seems to depict one of the white men using the American flag as a spear to plunge at Landsmark. Although the white man was actually just waving the flag, Landsmark and the black doctor treating him wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to shed light on the Boston busing situation.
2 days after the attack, Landsmark held a press conference at the Harriet Tubman House. In a room crowded with media outlets, Landsmark arrived with a huge bandage covering his nose. Tape ran up towards his forehead and across his face. The excessive bandaging was intentional and was part of the plan Landsmark and the black doctor made to help gain national attention. Their efforts worked, and the photo helped to show that racism wasn't just a Southern issue, but it was an issue that all regions, including the North, had to deal with too.
I was taken by surprise, and I was beaten and kicked by a crowd of young people coming from an anti-busing rally in City Hall.
To learn more about busing, I called up my friend Rudy, who grew up in Roslindale, Massachusetts, and had first-hand experience with busing. Here are some insightful things that he said during the interview.
Did you ever see, any protests or riots due to the busing? Absolutely. So when we were bused in sixth grade, there were about, I think, 8, 9, 10 buses that picked up all these white kids from where I grew up and met at a shopping mall. And then we got police escorted to the school where I went, middle school.
Oh, wow.
And then at the end of the day in sixth grade, they would let all the local kids out first and then bus the white kids home. So the local kids would be like throwing rocks and bottles. And, you know, I was on a couple of buses where like windows got broken. And again, we were all like kind of friends. So the black kids be like, hey, I think there's going to be some trouble today. So you might want to like duck behind your seat, you know? And we were like, why don't they let the white kids go home first? They bust all these kids into Mattapan, where I went to middle school for a year. And then so your homeroom was like 25 black kids and 5 white kids, right?
Yeah.
And then you'd go to your first period, let's say it was English, and all of a sudden your English class is like 25 white kids and 5 black kids. So within the school, the whole segregation thing didn't work. I mean, we were all really friendly. That was the other thing too. Like, you know, we see stuff on the news every night with like local parents, you know, from South Boston throwing rocks at buses and be like, you know, what are they doing? Like, the kids are going to school. Just leave them alone.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
leave them alone, you know? But it was pretty funny. Neighborhood kids would tell me like, oh, hey, Rudy, like, I think there's going to be some shit today, Friday at 5 o'clock. Like, you might want to just duck under your seat, you know?
Yeah.
Because they knew something was going to happen. And I used to stay after school, and like, I had a teacher that be like, oh, if you're staying after school today, he lived near my house. He'd be like, you definitely want to ride home with me. You don't want to like walk down to the local T-stop and take the bus because, you know, again, racial tensions were pretty bad back then.
Another interesting thing that Rudy and I discussed was the METCO program. The METCO program was established to help combat the current diversification and educational opportunity disparities. From their website, they claim to be a, quote, voluntary program intended to expand educational opportunities, increase diversity, and reduce racial isolation by permitting students in certain cities to attend public schools in other communities that have agreed to participate. During the interview, Rudy told me that Winchester High School, for example, does not participate in the METCO program due to racial tension that he believes still exists in the town.
All in all, the METCO program has been immensely beneficial for disadvantaged students. Research conducted by NPR shows that nearly 90% of METCO's Black and Latino students graduate from their high school on time, and they score higher on state achievement tests than their peers in Boston Public Schools. Boston Public Schools also have their own method for providing educational opportunities to their students and keeping them close to home. However, the method in which schools are assigned to students in this program is severely flawed, and as a result, many students are put in schools that aren't their top choice. Families must make a list of preferred schools, ordered with their top choice being first on the list. Then there is a computerized lottery that is supposedly weighted to help kids get into their first choice. The early registration deadline that the program offers have hurt Black, Hispanic, and low-income families. That's in part because they move more frequently, which means, in turn, they apply later and get less of a chance to pick from the most coveted and high-achieving schools. This crucial flaw undermines the entire goal of this program, which was to help minority groups.
Boston busing is commonly considered a failure. The white flight is a major reason to blame because it limited the amount of white students actually attending the desegregated schools, and because of this, kept those schools just as racially separate as they were before. Forced busing also did little to change the racial makeup of most schools, and there are still large traces of segregation all throughout the public schools in Massachusetts. For example, only 4.4% of Arlington High School students, 3.4% of Lexington High School students, and 1.6% of Winchester High School students in 2018 were African American.
However, it's wrong to say that Boston busing was a complete failure. Although Boston busing didn't fully achieve its main goal of desegregating public schools, it paved the way for more diverse schools and led to programs like METCO, which have been proven to have helped minority groups. Boston busing was also necessary in order to finally implement the reforms directed by the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. Boston busing failed not because it was a bad idea, but more because the abundance of racism at the time prevented it from doing its job.